Well, hello yet again. I'm glad to see that everyone is settled and have had their salad. It's time to kick off the formal part of tonight's banquet. Before I introduce Michelle, I just want to, on behalf of all of Humber College, thank everyone who is not from Humber College for coming to Humber today, for participating in the Paralegal Cup Day 1. We appreciate any and all guests who come here. And then if I could say to all of the people who are from Humber, thank you for being here. Glad you're here. And I'll have some time later on to offer some more thanks. But at this point, just to move things along, I'd like to introduce you to Michelle Haigh.
Hi everyone, I'm so glad everyone could make it tonight. This is a great turnout. I don't know about anyone else, but I had a fantastic day. Today was so much fun. I first want to just start out by saying thank you to all the Mooters. I am thoroughly impressed by the amount of work and effort and advocacy skills you presented today, the professionalism, everything you did today was top notch. The caliber is bar none. So congratulations to all you Mooters. And as we all know, today absolutely would not have happened without the Paralegal Cup Steering Committee. So I want everyone to give a round of applause to Fallon Burns, Doug Taylor, Karen Fair, and Sarah Liddon. And without their hard work and the support of Humber College, again, this event would not have happened. Humber College has backed this program, which I think is fantastic. It is the first of its kind for the paralegal community, and I want to thank Humber College for allowing us to use your venue and the support you've given the steering committee to make this happen. I also think this event ran very smoothly this year. I was here last year, and it was great for the first year. And you know, they had a lot of work to do, but I thought last year was fantastic. This year was 10 times better. And I also think that that goes to the support of all 40+ volunteers that helped out today, including the judges, students, and so forth that had helped out today. So congratulations to you all, and thank you for participating. The first speaker of the evening is going to be Doug Taylor from the Paralegal Cup Steering Committee. He's a third-year degree student here at Humber College, and I'd just like to bring him up now and let him say a few words.
Sorry. Thank you, Michelle and James. I'd certainly like to echo James' sentiment. I'd like to add that I think we've truly embraced the sense of community this year. I think it's well reflected from the intercollegiate alternate teams to our diverse team of student volunteers across several colleges and professional volunteers from across the paralegal community. And lastly, in our community and presenting partners. I'd especially like to thank my steering committee members, Karen Fair, Sarah Liddon, and of course, I'd be remiss not to thank someone else. And in case anyone is curious about her dedication to the Paralegal Cup, I can share my personal experience. Here's a woman who completed her field placement last summer in what is arguably one of the busiest paralegal offices in Toronto. And instead of taking the subway home to relax after a grueling day at the office, she made her way to come and see me here at work. Right here in L1000, and spending maybe another 5 or 6 hours planning the Paralegal Cup. So this just serves as one example of why she is my student mentor. And I would ask you to join me in acknowledging Fallon Burns specifically for her vision and leadership. Thank you. Okay, so I just want to really briefly introduce our theme and maybe provide a little bit of context. Access to justice, as we all know, is an age-old problem and traditionally has been affecting the disadvantaged, usually those on the margins of society. I think what has changed in the last 20 years is the cost of litigation has drastically affected the middle class. Our justice system is not built to what some courts now have reached upwards of 80% of litigants being self-represented. My personal first introduction to the history of access to justice came in 2012 through a conference speech by our keynote speaker, Toni de Mello. She talked a little bit about a 2007 case, Dougal Christie and the Attorney General. And in that case, the Supreme Court held that there was no general constitutional right to counsel and proceedings before courts and tribunals dealing with rights and obligations, and that the right to access the courts is not absolute. Finally, the general access to to legal services, is also not currently a recognized aspect of or precondition to the rule of law. So this really opened my eyes to the subject. Our Chief Justice McLaughlin has really galvanized the national agenda for access to justice, in part by highlighting Canada's poor rating on the International Access to Justice indicators. She has noted with dismay that in 2002, World Justice Project found that on civil justice, Canada ranked 9th out of 16 North American and Western European nations, and 13th among the world's highest income countries. Under the stewardship of Justice Cromwell, the National Action Committee released a final report in October of 2013. The report really sets out some legal reform targets that are framed as measurable, and they have concrete goals. The CBA and the Federation of Law Societies of Canada both support the Action Committee's initiatives. And it's from this backdrop that a fantastic opportunity exists for paralegals. It essentially rises out of this backdrop. We're fortunate enough to reside in Ontario, where the OBA and the LSUC have followed their national organizations and have really been exemplary in their leadership in the area of law reform. As an example, in 2010, the OBA, the LSUC, CLEO, Legal Aid Ontario, and others, through the Law Foundation of Ontario, produced the Ontario Civil Legal Needs Project. For the first time ever, they completed a comprehensive study of Ontario's judicial system, and paralegals participated in the focus groups for the report. The report found that paralegals provide essential services to Ontarians. These sentiments, which are echoed in the OBA 5-year paralegal review and the Law Society of Upper Canada's 5-year report to the Attorney General. This is a great time to be a paralegal. We're coming into an era where the value of paralegal services are being realized as an opportunity to improve social justice. Further, the OBA's Legal Future initiatives and the creation of the Law Society of Upper Canada's TAG, which is the Action Group on Access to Justice, have featured paralegals in the forefront to some bold and innovative proposals in delivering legal services to the public. As paralegal students, you are the future of the paralegal profession. It is through your leadership that we will continue to evolve how we deliver legal services and meet the demands for affordable legal services. To quote Justice Cromwell, "A moment of opportunity is at hand, a moment created by a broad consensus on the need for significant change to improve access to justice. This is a critical moment, and a riff on the idea of thinking globally and systematically while acting locally. What can I do, either myself or working with others, to contribute to equal access to justice?" Thank you.
I just have some housekeeping that I forgot to mention earlier. Dinner is going to be served any minute now. I just wanted to address the quarterfinals for tomorrow morning. Everyone's going to find out who moves on later this evening, but for the judges and everything who are here for tomorrow, I just want to outline who is participating in the quarterfinals. So in room 1005, it'll be Andrew Hyland, John Pearson, Marion Lippa, and Samantha Glass. In room 1006, it's Michelle Migu, Jennifer Bell, and Lainey Yang. In room 1010 is Claude Gelbard, Joe Kipax, and Judith Schoenwald. And in room 1011, it's Nancy Miller, Jim Moak, and Kristen Bisbee. The quarterfinals will start at 9 a.m. sharp. So enjoy your dinner. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, John Pearson. He holds an LLM and JD from York University's Osgoode Hall Law School, in addition to a BA in History and English from the University of Toronto. He is a member of the Law Society of Upper Canada, the International Association of Prosecutors, and former member of the bars of Nova Scotia and the Northwest Territories. John has over 35 years' experience in the criminal justice system. Since 2009, he has been a general counsel in the Crown Law Office Criminal Division at the Ministry of the Attorney General for Ontario. This is where he conducts complex trials and appeals. John also supports the Deputy Minister on the National Steering Committee for Justice Efficiencies and Access to Justice. In 2005, John was awarded the Excelsior Team Award by the Government of Ontario for his work on the Justice Delay Reduction Initiative. Everyone, please welcome John Pearson.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Distinguished guests, courageous mooters, ladies and gentlemen, what are the hallmarks of effective advocacy? There was a young boy. He broke his neck on a concrete protrusion out of a swimming pool. He sued. A sympathetic local jury made an exemplary damages award. The insurance company went to Edson Haynes, who at that time was the Ontario Insurance Bar Dean. He went with the case to the Court of Appeal, and his opening submission was as follows. May it please the court, should my client be held liable because he equipped his swimming pools with safety ledges to protect those who are in the shallow end? Now, I don't know what the outcome of that case was, but I can tell you that the judges started to refer to the concrete protrusion as a safety ledge. And by the end of the case, even the lawyer on the other side was referring to it as a safety ledge. That was an example of Edson Haynes dealing with what I suggest is perhaps the most important thing for you as an advocate. What is the question in your case? You often see counsel who've obviously put in lots of work. They know the facts of the case, they know the law of the case cold, but they've not asked themselves, what is the central question here? They have not done like great generals do and determined where they wanted to fight the battle. That is one of the most important things you can do. If you know all the facts cold and you know all the law, you're going to be like a freight train in the night with no idea where you're going. Or as Yogi Berra said, if you don't know where you're going, you'll never get there. Now, this is not an astounding suggestion. Those of you who are familiar with King Lear, Shakespeare's wonderful play, will know that the first line in King Lear, when he decides he's going to divide up his kingdom, is, "Who of my daughters doth love me the most?" That's the question that whole play revolves around. All of the insanity in that play comes from that opening question. So Shakespeare saw the importance of an opening, and I suggest that that's something you should look for too. Now, the next suggestion is, what is the solution? Here, once again, the issue is not how well prepared am I, because obviously you have to be prepared. That goes without saying. The issue is, how are you going to help the judges solve the case? Put yourself in the judge's seat and develop a solution, obviously one that'll suit your client, but one that helps the judge out. A great example of that was in the patriation reference, where the federal government decided, because of Pierre Trudeau, that they were going to go and bring back the Canadian Constitution from the United Kingdom. And the federal government took the position that the federal government spoke on behalf of Canada, and it didn't really matter what the provinces thought. Now, the provinces, of course, didn't like that idea. They pointed to the fact that at Confederation, they'd all signed up as equal partners. So you had a situation where those two extremes were presented to the Supreme Court of Canada. Saskatchewan realized that they wanted to have a say, so they didn't like the federal position, but they also realized that there was no way that the provincial provision or position was going to win. There was no way that PEI was going to have as big a say as Ontario. So they looked at the bigger picture, and they knew that the Supreme Court of Canada did not like the fact that this hot potato had been dropped in its lap. So they argued that what was required was substantial consent from the provinces. And that was the answer the Supreme Court of Canada wanted, because it, in effect, allowed the court to adopt that term and throw it back to the politicians to negotiate what substantial consent meant. So it was a great example of the advocate coming up with a solution that worked for the court. It wasn't totally what the client would have wanted, perhaps, but it gave sufficient to the client that the client would always have a say in the patriation discussions. Point first, advocacy. There are, of course, libraries full of books on advocacy. Usually they say, you know, the top three things are prepare, prepare, prepare. Well, that's kind of a penetrating glimpse into the obvious. If you're going to be an advocate, you have to be prepared every time you appear in court. Some of them bear the title 1,000 Tips from Advocates. Well, I can't remember 1,000 tips. I can't even remember my passwords. The more conspiratorial ones say 10 secrets of great advocates. And Ed Greenspan claims that he's read all of these books, and he's been able to boil it down to one secret. Don't ever ask him what it is, though. He says he's going to take it to the grave with him. I picked up in a remainder bin a book by a lawyer, quite colorful lawyer from Wyoming called Jerry Spence. He wrote this book called How to Win Every Argument. So I read it from beginning to end, and I never found out what would happen if the opponent had read the book as well. He just didn't tell you. So you will often hear that good advocacy requires that you tell a story. Well, that's kind of true, but it's not a mystery novel. You don't write it with the view that the reader won't know until the last page what the story was about. You start out by telling the reader, the judge, the adjudicator, what the story's about. Because it's just the way the human brain works, that you absorb and remember what you hear first. So, once again, Shakespeare could have given his point at the end of King Lear. You know, the fact that Lear's hubris left him to try to delegate his responsibilities to his daughters. But he didn't. He wanted the audience to know, as the play unfolded, what was going to happen. You want the judge or the adjudicator to know that as well. And while I'm on this point first, advocacy, never have more than 3 points. Justice Finlayson used to say he'd never seen a case where an advocate won on his 4th best point. It just doesn't happen. I'm always amazed in court where people stand up and say, I have 12 points, and the judges go, oh my God, and then counsel get upset because the judges won't allow them to belabor their 12 points. Like, all of this wastes time. If we're talking about access to justice, if we could cut down the amount of time a lot of us spend in court because we go on too long, then we would open up some time. So, too often, people have point last submissions or no point at all. And, you know, that is not effective advocacy. Now, there's a tendency on the part of inexperienced advocates to forget that while you know, or should know, the case very well, the adjudicator does not. Yours is not the only one that the adjudicator has to deal with. He or she probably has many, many more. So from the perspective of your client, the best thing you can do is explain as simply and quickly as possible to the adjudicator what the case is from the perspective of your client. Bearing in mind, of course, that you must always deal with the other side's points. Don't ignore them. They won't go away. You've got to address them. It's not always easy. The legendary advocate J.J. Robinette was retained to argue a case from British Columbia where there was binding authority from the Supreme Court of Canada in the Howe Sound case that was foursquare against him. So he opened up his submission to the Supreme Court of Canada with the following. Howe Sound, my lords, is Howe Sound. Once again, it really didn't answer the court's question, but it was such a beguiling way to begin that they just loved him for it. I say 3 points because I think there's something magical about 3. Peace, order, good government. Fraternité, liberté, égalité. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. There's some reason why if you make an argument in 3s, it sticks in the human mind. Forget the wind up and make the pitch. This is a great example of people who don't have courage. Courage is crucial if you're going to be an advocate. You have to decide what points you're going to make. You have to discard the dross. It's not always easy, but it's what you're being paid for. That's the argument that will succeed. It's not your fifth argument. Lengthy submissions, lengthy written submissions. They always remind me of the philosopher Pascal, who apologized to a friend for the length of his letter and said, sorry, I didn't have time to write a shorter one. That's very much the case when it comes to submissions. Finish your factum, finish your submissions a week before you have to deliver them. And then prune, prune, prune. The more concise, the better. Now, I want to enlist your assistance dealing with my last submission. So please raise your hand if you agree. Your most valuable asset as an advocate is your knowledge of the law. Who thinks that's right? No one. Okay. Who says your most valuable asset is the length of your client list? How about the most valuable asset as an advocate is your reputation? Good, good. It's that bubble reputation. It's like trust. Once you lose it, it's very hard to get it back. No matter how important a case seems at the time, it's not worth losing your reputation over. Your reputation follows you. How do you get a good reputation? Well, you remember what your parents told you. Manners are important. Be nice to people. Respect is something you give, and you get it if you give it. Civility is not only an ethical requirement, it's also a way to make your job less stressful. When you have to get somewhere, get there 15 minutes early. And that's a hard one. But there's nothing worse than an advocate comes in bustling, disorganized, and does not give a professional appearance. There's nothing wrong, there's nothing worse than an advocate who says, oh, the traffic was bad. You know, as if the traffic in Toronto is ever good. You know, it just doesn't work. So you've been a patient audience. I've probably gone a little bit longer than I should, but you've been such a good audience that I want to finish with a secret that I was told early in my career by Charles Dubin, later Chief Justice Dubin. It was after I'd given one of those long, meandering submissions in the Court of Appeal, and he took me aside and suggested I adopt the triple S strategy he always used. Stand up, speak up, shut up. Enjoy your dessert.
We're going to keep this moving along just a little bit. I know dessert's going to be served in the next 5 or 10 minutes, but before we get there, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. I'm sure that it's been a long day for most people here, and if we can move this along and get some rest before the big day tomorrow, I'm sure we'd all appreciate it. So our next speaker is going to be Cathy Corsetti. She has graduated from the Humber College Law Clerk program in 1977, well before many of you here were even born. She has been, she's a good friend of mine, so I can say this stuff. Since 1982, she's been providing paralegal services to her clients, mainly in the landlord and tenant board arena and as well as small claims court. She brings 37 years of experience in the legal field. Along with some of her colleagues, she was the co-founder of Independent Paralegals at Court, which was called IPAC, which met monthly during the regulation process for paralegals to discuss their concerns with what regulation meant to them. On numerous occasions, she met with the Law Society with respect to policy suggestions, which resulted in paralegal updates that was implemented by the Law Society because of their meetings. In 2010, she was elected as a member of the Paralegal Standing Committee at the Law Society of Upper Canada and was subsequently re-elected in 2014. When she was first elected in 2010, she was immediately appointed as chair of the committee, and she continues to serve in that role to this day. And she's done a fantastic job. I don't know how she continues to manage her business with all the work she does there. And among several other committees that she appears on at the Law Society, she's also currently the co-chair of the Access to Justice Committee, which is probably one of the main reasons why she's here to speak today. Everyone welcome Cathy Corsetti.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Mind you, I don't know, I think I'm blushing. Not about the year I graduated. But I want to thank, first of all, the organizers of today's event. It was just amazing, absolutely amazing. I was here last year, as many of us that are here tonight, as a judge. And last year, I was absolutely blown away by the talent that came before me. But today, again, absolutely unbelievable. Everyone give themselves a round of applause. It was amazing. But more than that, I really think we need to thank the staff from the colleges that were here as coaches and the teacher staff, and I don't know what everyone is, whether they're just good friends of the Mooters, but to take a Saturday, which is so valuable for all of us, to be here to encourage your students, I think that's just amazing. You're making our profession proud, because this is what's going to make our new profession just amazing advocates in our field of paralegal. So all the students need to give their coaches a big round of applause. And as Michelle said, my name is Cathy Corsetti. Oh, this does move. Holy. It's not the wine. I have a lot of friends here today, apparently not. Okay, my name is Cathy Corsetti. I'm chair of the Paralegal Standing Committee at the Law Society, and as Michelle said, I graduated from Humber College, yes, in 1977. They graduated us really, really, really young back then, but I'm happy to be back at Humber College, and I'm very proud of this event, and I wish we had it back in 1977 when I graduated. In fact, when I graduated, there was no such thing as paralegals. We were called agents. It was a law clerk program, and today I practice, as Michelle said, solely in landlord and tenant, representing corporate clients, and I so enjoyed my career. 37 years and still going, probably another 70 because I have no pension plan, but that's another story. So welcome everyone to this new exciting profession. And get a pension plan. So I am an elected bencher of the Law Society, chair of the Paralegal Standing Committee, and co-chair of Access to Justice Committee. And as you know, the Law Society regulates both lawyers and paralegals in the public interest. And every 4 years, the paralegals will have to vote for their new standing committee. And today we're lucky enough to have 3 of us here. Michelle Haigh is also a bencher at the Law Society, and Brian Laurie is also a bencher at the Law Society. Since the theme of this moot is access to justice, I'd like to mention a few things that the Paralegal Standing Committee has worked on to assist paralegals, but also the people of Ontario. We were very excited that at the request of the Paralegal Standing Committee, the Law Society opened the Law Society Referral Service to include paralegals, Is this giving feedback or just in my head? Okay, sorry, just in my head. This is a great service not only to obtain client referrals, but also to inform the public what paralegals can do and what our scope is. I encourage all paralegals to join the referral service, which is offering access to justice to the public of Ontario. In fact, the first 6 months of this program, the referral service, including paralegals, over 2,000 paralegals' names were given out to people in Ontario, raising a revenue of $335,000. I am a member of the Law Society Referral Service, and I benefited from that money as well. So it's a great service, and I encourage everyone to become a member. Recently, I attended the Federation of Law Societies Symposium in Nova Scotia, along with Brian Laurie. As today the theme being access to justice, it was also the theme of the Federation. We were the first paralegals to ever be invited to the Federation of Law Societies convention, and it was quite a thrill for Brian and I. The convention was there was a poverty simulation put on by the Halifax United Way. It was very interesting. It was an interesting exercise where we all took on different identities. I'd love everyone to ask Brian what his identity was later. I won't embarrass him now, but he did learn how to breastfeed because he couldn't afford food, so. But he was a female, I'll put that out there. It was really interesting that we all take things for granted. It helped us appreciate why some people get into trouble because of poverty, and it is an effective for paralegals, I think, to understand other people's hardships. I think if you want to help them, you can, and it truly makes a difference, and I think as paralegals, we have that job to help make a difference to the people of Ontario. We were also welcomed by all provinces' law societies who were very interested in hearing about paralegal regulation and how we can help the people of different provinces obtain access to justice. Brian and I had just a few weeks before been invited out to Vancouver to speak to the Law Society of British Columbia on their regulation, or their task force on regulation of paralegals. So paralegals in Ontario have a very exciting future. Possibly regulation will be across the country, not just in Ontario. And we are professionals that can assist people in their legal needs. I wanted to mention to the new licensees here about appearing before not just the popular tribunals. There are so many tribunals that we have that we are able to appear before. And besides just the one like I do, the Landlord and Tenant Board, there is so many that are unrepresented. 80% of people are unrepresented at tribunals. For example, the Human Rights Tribunals, Social Services Review Board, Assessment Review Board, or many other tribunals that participants need representation. I believe that we can all make a difference in this profession, providing access to justice to the unrepresented, simply by showing professionalism. Some of the professionalism I saw today is what I really encouraged the profession to enhance. When you look good, when you make your client look good, it's helping our profession, and I think that's really important. And as paralegals, we can get the job done. In closing, my recommendation to all students would be to start today creating yourself as a paralegal. Do not wait till graduation day. Start volunteering, shadowing, observing other paralegals in court, and of course networking, like at an event today. Join a paralegal association, join on LinkedIn, a network of paralegal networking, and also there's a magazine, Paralegal Scope magazine, that updates the different articles and what's happening to paralegals and what's new in our profession. I look forward to meeting everyone who mooted today. At the completion of your licensing exam at the Law Society, there is a welcoming reception held in April and November of each year, and I wish you every success in launching your new exciting career as a licensed paralegal. Thank you.
It's now time to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, Tanya, also known as Toni de Mello. Toni has graduated from the University of Waterloo with a BA in Honors Economics and Political Science. Using her educational, business, and consulting background, she co-founded 2 nonprofit organizations in Toronto, Toronto Volunteer Bridge and the World Youth Centre. Thereafter, she undertook a master's in public policy at the Woodrow Wilson School in Princeton University. When she arrived at Princeton, she immediately founded the Woodrow Wilson Workers, aimed at engaging graduate students in flexible community service opportunities in New Jersey and New York. Toni undertook a summer internship where she worked in peace building through the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. This was in Geneva. Subsequently, she worked in the UNHCR field office in Colombia, directly with a displaced population, where she led a needs assessment that she later used to advocate for the rights of the displaced population. While in Colombia, Toni realized that the rights of those that are displaced or flee as refugees are constrained and dictated by international law and domestic policies. She wanted to work in the field with those in need, but also wanted to play a role in shaping and transforming policies and systems at a higher level. She enrolled in a dual law degree at McGill Law School and became a lawyer in June 2012. She has recently begun working as a Director of Diversity and Equity at the University of Toronto, Scarborough campus. Her past experience and future efforts will undoubtedly assist in the creation of access to justice for Ontarians. Everyone welcome Toni de Mello.
So I know you've all had a very, very long day, and so I thank you for your attention. I could tell from the other speakers that you are as engaged as I remember the students that I came here to speak with many times I've been to Humber, and I've always been welcome in a way that makes me want to come back. So thank you for your attention. I will try not to keep you till midnight, because I know many of you have to get up quite early tomorrow to come back. So as was introduced, I am an economist and a finance and business person who ended up working in humanitarian affairs and later took that career and translated it into a legal career. And now I'm working in human rights at a university. And so it's a very eclectic background, as John would say, and one I'm going to share a little bit with you tonight. But I thought the first thing I would start out with is telling you about what brought me to think about access to justice, specifically in the legal context. And then I'm going to give you 3 tips, because I heard that works really well, of ways I think you can do that, not just in your careers, but in your personal lives. So Doug had talked about this. How many of you have heard of Dugald Christie? Okay, so under 2 people. Okay, so this was the same thing for me. I had started law school at McGill. I'd been working for 10 years. And I'd worked in business, I'd worked in finance, I'd worked internationally, and then I started this legal degree at McGill, and about 2 months into my program, I heard about a man named Dugald Christie. So Christie was a lawyer in British Columbia, who most people don't know was actually doing extremely well as a corporate lawyer, and he's somebody who eventually had an issue with a summer home that he had, that in the winter, an avalanche destroyed it. And so Christie, as a lawyer, thought, okay, I'll just deal with it, and I'll deal with the insurance, and I'll work on this. And he had such a difficult time in what he called accessing justice that he couldn't imagine what it would be like for other people that didn't have his means, his knowledge of the law, his resources, and his connections. And it changed his life. So what Christie started doing was thinking about ways he could help people navigate what he had found to be a very, very difficult process for him as a lawyer. And he started opening pro bono clinics. And he didn't do them in the traditional sense where he had lawyers staffed and they were done through, Pro Bono Canada, through the Law Society. But he tried to take the clinics and actually put them in the communities where he thought people could use them. So they have these parks, for example, that started by Christie, where it's like, come and get legal advice for a day. And they'll have all of these lawyers and paralegals that are just volunteering, or people that want to give legal information. And people just can come up and say, I have this question, how can I navigate the process? And Christie became really, really, really prolific in BC. And And one of the things he started to realize was that our barriers, our threshold for what you need to make in terms of a salary in order to access legal aid were so low that he argued you basically had to be homeless to qualify. So as was said by Doug, there's this huge portion of people that you could say make a little bit more, or people that are making above the poverty line, but couldn't afford to go to court, couldn't access, right? And people that are just above it are barely making it by anyway, so they didn't have an access to justice. And he felt that this was unconstitutional and something that literally undermined the character of Canadian values in terms of a country that believes in the pursuit of fairness and justice. So he launched a case, and it's the case that Doug was talking about. And basically what he wanted was there to be a threshold that was set so that people could actually access legal aid and take issues to court. And as you can see, he's a quirky guy, very well loved everywhere, wore his robes and decided to bike across Canada to the Supreme Court to raise awareness about lack of access to justice. So my constitutional prof is telling this story in much less detail than I did. And then she says on the second time that he did it, because he raised so much awareness, he was hit by a van and killed. Christy died in 2006. So we're in constitutional law class, and it shattered me. I had never heard this person's name ever. I hear Terry Fox every single year, and I love Terry Fox, but I had never once heard this person's name in Canada in any legal context. And he is such a warrior. If you say his name in BC, everyone knows him. And I wondered why we didn't know him, but I also realized that I myself was so busy reading summaries and trying to figure out what the arguments were. Half the time I couldn't even figure out who had won the case. I don't know if anyone's had that experience, but you're like, I don't actually know what the holding is, right? That I had forgotten that the whole reason I went to law school was because I had this passion for access to justice. And that moment transformed my legal experience. And so what I decided is not only would I know about Christy, but I felt that every law student who came into McGill while I was there would hear and learn about Christy. And the lens with which they would have as they went into their legal studies, as we try to manage the volume that we need to learn, would be around this concept of what is it I'm trying to achieve and how can I best do that? How can I reach people who do not have what we have? And so what I decided to do was a bike ride. And what we did was the very next year, in orientation in the first week, you would ride a bike for 100 kilometers, which is a very long amount, I'll have you know. I'd never ridden more than 5 kilometers. And we would do it in Christy's honor, but the whole principle would be we'd raise money for a local pro bono legal clinic. And it started 6 years ago, or 5 years ago, and it's been going every year since, and it's become a flagship event of the Faculty of Law at McGill. Faculty does it now, staff does it, they bring their children, people bring their families. And the idea is to start us all not only with that lens, but also developing a community that we can talk about these issues because we all get pretty busy at work. So Christy talked about 3 things, John Pearson, 3 things that he thought would really make a difference. He called them the ABCs to access to justice. And he said there are 3 things we need to think about. So the first has already been mentioned, and I know it's mentioned in many of our discussions, and it's the concept of access to justice being affordable. And this is a role where I really think that paralegals have and will make an even greater difference in people accessing justice. I will say as a lawyer that I think any lawyer will agree that many of the fees associated with the legal process are prohibitive for our average citizen, right? You can argue they're prohibitive for even people that are making above median income in Canada. They say that civil suits, even a 3-day suit can cost up to $60,000 in costs. So thinking if the median income in Canada is $58,000, what are we asking people to do to have a simple civil suit, right? So affordability is a huge, huge question that comes around access to justice. Being brief is another question, says the speaker who's going to speak for 45 minutes. But it's something I think about often, right? When I'm reading cases, when I'm reading academic literature around law, that sometimes we spend 50 or 60 pages saying something that we could concisely say in several paragraphs. And people get lost in that. As John was talking about, hearing people plead endlessly and not even remembering what the point of law was because you're just exhausted, right? And we see this not only in the legal system, but I find we see it a lot now in political movements and in our politics, right? Where they literally we just wear people down by talking at them. And I think it's something that we need to think about. And the last thing Christy talked about was being comprehensible. And I think this is one thing I really struggle with. I struggle with the fact that so many people can't access the law because they can't digest it. They don't understand it. How many of you are on Facebook? Right? So you know you have to click agree. Do all of you do what I do, which is you go through it and you just hit agree to Google, agree to, right? And I've had friends come to me and say, can you walk me through this because I literally have no idea of what I'm agreeing to. And half the time I don't know and I'm a lawyer, right? So how many situations do we create that even for a common user that may be a layperson and not understand legal language, they have no sense of how to digest that language? I remember hearing the word factum and saying, what's a factum? I now have to memorize that term. And I was like, somebody explained it to me and I was like, it's your argument? Why do they call it a factum? Why is there so much Latin in these cases? Why don't I understand that? Like, I literally was lost half the time because little words we use, you know, everything from jurisprudence to the millions of Latin terms that we use. And I struggle with this because any person working in law will tell you that in order to be effective in law, you actually need a specificity of language, right? That's literally what tears arguments apart to say, you know, what is the statute of limitations? What does that word mean? How can we interpret it? What's the loophole? But at the same time, so many times I've found that the language that we use almost purposely is so precise and so complicated that it blocks people's access to digest it. And the reason that it matters is because every day people are affected by things. And I'm not just talking about people that are at, you know, making the lowest incomes in this country. But within a week of starting law school, my mother was like, just so you know, I have a couple questions about our mortgage, and I have a couple of questions about my neighbor and the tree, and I heard you could, and I was like, I just started, Mom, I don't have my books. But because you will be the people that have that sort of knowledge information, you are a source of knowledge now, right? The minute you enter into your studies, it really matters that we make it, when we can, clear and digestible for people. So I guess the question is how? Right? So I've told you what we should do and how important it is, and I hope I've stressed that and I've made that point clear. But the main question that we have is how, and I guess I'd have 3 points to tell you how. Da-dum-dum. So my first is that I think we always focus on who you are, who we are, and what we should do. And I think we forget who it is that we're trying to serve. So the number one tip I give to anybody who's going to do work in access to justice is connect to the communities that you are actually serving. And I think the number of times I have been on a committee or deciding or debating something where the people who are going to be most affected by that are not present, I can count in the stars. And I think we do it often, right? We forget that in order to know people, in order to help people, we have to actually know their issues. Some people would argue you have to go as far as to understanding what it is to live in their communities, right? And have those experiences. Last week at the University of Toronto, I'm out in Scarborough, we were talking about this constant problem with transportation and that we didn't know what to do because there isn't great access to the Scarborough campus and it's a huge block. And all I said was, I think if every executive wasn't allowed to park and had to take the subway, we'd have this problem solved in less than a month. If you're not experiencing what it is the population you're experiencing needs solved, if you haven't missed a class, missed a meeting, not known what it is to carry groceries for 15 blocks, then you're not going to be able to think in the same way as you would had you experienced that. And I don't think it means you always have to experience it, but what I think it means is you need to connect to the communities you're serving because they're living it every day. Right? I think the places that are represented here, I know that the programs, I know George Brown and Humber very well, and I know those programs really put a focus on that, and I think that's important. One of the quotations that I love, that I often use, this really transformed me in the work that I'm doing, and it's Lilla Watson, who's an Aboriginal educator and activist in Australia. And she says, if you have come here to help me, then you are wasting our time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And to me, what that's saying is come and work with me. Don't work for me. Don't import your ideas and your solutions, but work with me. One of the things I feel that's important is sort of sharing some of the benefits of what happens when we actually work with people and we work within our communities. One of the first questions I get whenever I do a talk, and it's announced that I worked at the United Nations for several years, is how do you get a job at the UN? How did that happen? Tell me the path. And I often say to students, you know, my story is not a linear path. I think we all expect, you know, in order to do this and eventually be to where the speaker is today or all these amazing speakers we heard, I need to do X, Y, and Z. I have a lot of people that are interested in medicine come to me. And they'll say, okay, what do I do? And they want answers like, well, the first thing you do is you have to be a candy striper, and then you have to tutor in biology. Then make sure you work at the Red Cross. Then make sure, and it's this recipe that we give people of how to get to a successful end. And what I say to people is, if you expose yourself to not only the people you want to work with, but to the things that actually move you and that you love, you will get there much faster. It'll happen organically. And so my story kind of looks like this rather than a linear path. But it ended up at a place that I'm quite proud of, and I think that came from genuine experiences. And one thing I say to all people, no matter where you are in your career, is continue to cultivate those genuine experiences so that they matter to you regardless of where you end up. So that if you don't end up at the highest post in the agency that you've always wanted to be, the work that you've done and the life that you've given has mattered to you. The way I ended up at the UN is that I've been in Toronto since I was 4 years old, but I was an immigrant to this country. And it came at a time where my parents really, really struggled. And my mother believed that because we had so much good fortune in the light of the fact that so many people from my mother's home country and my father's home country suffered so much, that I had an obligation to give back. So I think I've forever been living my life trying to reconcile sort of the blessings I have in light of the fact that so many people don't have access to those privileges. So I did a lot of volunteer work, and I was always active in the community with my parents. And then when I went to school, my parents kind of slipped in that you can do that stuff for fun, and you can do that stuff in the evening, but you're not going to do that stuff for a living, right? You're going to be a lawyer or a doctor or something that can bring in rent. You can work at a bank, but we want you to do your social stuff, justice stuff at night. And so I worked as a consultant, I got into finance, but I found at night, every minute I had, I was kind of working on these 2 NGOs with my friends. And more as that became a part of who I was, people at work started to notice. And one of my bosses said, I really see you doing that full time. So I ended up pursuing graduate studies at Princeton to sort of develop a career in how I could do stuff around engaging communities, civic action, community service, those kinds of things. How can that even be a career? So I attended this public policy school at Princeton that's supposedly the first or second school in the world. And my second week at the school, Hurricane Katrina ravaged the Gulf Coast. I don't know how many of you remember that. But I remember watching people literally drown in what I was told was the most powerful government in the world. And here I was at Princeton, and nobody was even talking about it. Literally, it wasn't in our courses, it wasn't in the keynote speeches, and I literally were watching them drown. And what people didn't know was one of the main reasons I was so affected is that 10 years before that, when I was an undergrad at Waterloo, I did this thing called a collegiate challenge. So it's with Habitat for Humanity, and the idea is that instead of doing a Girls Gone Wild, Boys Gone Wild to the Dominican Republic for spring break, that we all know well, you'd spend your spring break with people that wanted to do something that would contribute to community. So what we did was we went and tried to build as many houses as we could in New Orleans. We worked in the 9th ward, which was the ward that was most affected by the hurricane, had the most deaths and the most devastation. And so when I was watching the TV, I wasn't watching something that I felt an urge to act on because it was just a tragedy objectively, but I was watching people die who I remembered as the faces of the people that I'd been working with. And I took a battalion of students down there, and we set up a medical clinic. We did a needs assessment. We ended up working with the Emergency Medical Act. We were only there for 20 days, but it had such a big impact, both on sort of my sense of what I wanted to do in my career, as well as on the work that was happening there, that they asked us to present for Congress. And when I was there, a woman who had worked at the UN came up to me, and she said, "What organization are you working with? We need to hire you." And I said, "Well, I'm just a student, and we're just volunteering." She was like, "I think you could do a career in emergency relief." And I was like, "What's emergency relief?" And she said, "There's a career in helping people get through emergencies, floods, fleeing war. I work at the United Nations. You're somebody I would love to." And I always say to people, it wasn't because I went to Princeton. It wasn't because I had all this pedigree. It wasn't because I was there under some government agency. It was because 10 years ago on my spring break, I decided to not be Girls Gone Wild and to do something where I would engage with a community that I thought I would want to know more about. So that's my story that I hoped would help. The second big thing that I always want to tell to a group of people that have the chance to be educated in our country is bring diverse people to the table. That is one of the best ways that we can open up access to justice anywhere. And it's not just because I'm the Director of Diversity and Equity. I think it's because I think this that I became the Director of Diversity and Equity. And what I mean by bring people to the table is not just give them a seat at the table, but actually open up a forum so that they have a voice. I think many people that are older than my generation will talk about what it was to be the token person but not be heard, right? To be put on the committee but that you never get up and speak. You're never given the lead role. To do all the work on something and have everybody else that are certain people from certain groups getting the privilege or getting the accolades or getting the praise, right? We hear about this all the time. So what I talk about when I say bring a diverse group of people to the table is to actually give them a seat at the table and have them be heard and be a part of the conversation. And the funny example that I used to talk about this is my dear friend Marilyn Manson. Now, what can we learn from Marilyn Manson about bringing a diverse group of people to the table? How many of you know who Marilyn Manson is? Okay, so this dates us because I got to tell you, when I talk about I give this example to students now. Half of them have never even heard of Marilyn Manson. And how many of you have heard of the massacre in Columbine? So almost all, great. So Marilyn Manson, for those of you who don't know, is a rock star that does this heavy metal hate, is what I call it. I am not a fan of Marilyn Manson. I was actually an anti-fan. I found Marilyn Manson parading on stage, preaching hate, calling for death to Christ, bleeding, showing all of his body parts at awards, revolting. And then I heard, no, but actually Marilyn Manson is really, really smart, and he doesn't believe any of that stuff, and he just does it to make money. So then I like Marilyn Manson even less. Because to me, that's not a smart business person. What that is you actually know better, and because you think something sells, you're going to preach and promote hate and grotesqueness. So I was like, oh, I now just like him more. And then I saw the movie Bowling for Columbine. And for those of you who don't know it, Columbine was a massacre in a high school that unfortunately is something that we see much more regularly. But when it happened, it was 2 young males in trench coats that went into their high school and just opened fire and killed many people. And it literally flattened North America. All over the world, but specifically Canada and the US were rocked by this act of violence and just our inability to understand what caused that. And these kids were bullied. They had had a really hard time. They had been alienated. But Michael Moore made a film called Bowling for Columbine, right? And in this film, he tries to unpack what it is that made these kids turn in the way they did and what we could have maybe done to stop them. And so he interviews Marilyn Manson. And he says to Marilyn Manson, the morning before these 2 boys came in and shot up an entire school, they were listening to your music the entire morning. The hate from your music, people believe, kind of instilled in them and was seeded in them, and then they'd use that kind of hate, and it provoked them to cause this violence. So what do you say to that? So then Marilyn Manson responds, our president just declared war on Iraq, and I'd like to believe I'm more powerful than the president of the United States, but I think we need to look at our entire culture and the message we send our children before we blame a music star for something that happened, right? So already I'm like, okay, Marilyn Manson. And then he says to Marilyn Manson, if you could have said anything to those boys then, because they did admire you in some way, if you could have said one thing, what would you have said that you think could have made a difference? And Marilyn Manson responds, I wouldn't have said anything. I would have listened, because that's what no one ever did. And if I could give one piece of advice about what it is to bring a diverse community to the table, from people like us who have had privileges that many of the people we will work with and access to justice don't have, it's if we can listen just a little bit better, I think that'll make all of the difference. And one of the things that's always shocked me in sort of any of the activities that I do around learning to listen better as a legal professional is that to try not, when somebody's talking, to think of our response. How many of you have had, with my mother or with my brother, with family, where somebody's talking, you already know what you're gonna say? Or you're so sure, have a client come in and you know where this is going. You've heard it a million times. Have a fellow student tell you about what their weekend and what, we have a sense of where we think people are going sometimes. And I think it's part of the beauty of our profession to kind of figure out where a sequence of events is going and try to think of how to respond, given if A happens, then, if not, B, right? But I think one of the things that's at great fault is we bring diverse communities to the table and they do not feel heard. If I hear anything, it's that even when we have these access to justice programs, I don't feel like anybody's listening, right? Or they're so bound by what they're told that they haven't heard what it is that I'm experiencing. The story that I shared that opened my eyes the most to this was a story around truth and reconciliation commissions in Canada. So I think many of you know, but not all of you will know, that for over 100 years there was a program with our federal government to take Aboriginal people out of their homes, youth, and put them in what's called residential schools. So the idea behind that was the only way to have these people assimilate, be transitioned from savages, be civilized, all of these kinds of principles. The only way to have them assimilate into our community was to remove them from theirs. So the principle behind it was if you put them in a residential schools, you took them out of the purview of their parents, of their communities, of their spiritual practices, right? And that was a way we could have them live in modern society. 150,000 Aboriginal people went through residential schools in Canada. And I'll tell you, at most places I speak, people haven't even heard of what a residential school is, right? So have those stories been heard? So borrowing from the South African example, our government decided in the last 10 years to do something called Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And after a big legal discussion about, does saying sorry mean we have to compensate for what we've done? And can we say sorry without compensating? And just be sorry, but we can't give you your land back, and sorry what happened, we're not going to give you money. There was a discussion that these circles could provide some way of acknowledging what had happened. So one of my closest friends was working in Iqaluit in Nunavut, and I went up there to see some of the work she was doing, and I had a chance to sit in on a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it was, for me, the most ashamed I've ever been to be a Canadian, and also the most proud I've ever been of an initiative that I do believe at its heart was to say, you have a right to share what's happened to you. And the consensus that I saw in the room when I heard people share what had happened to them, how it had continued to affect their daily lives, and how it was affecting their children, was that it isn't so much that we want money. It isn't so much that we need you to sit and give us some document that says you've been acknowledged. It's that you're willing to actually listen to what we said, and by recording it and archiving it, our prayer is that it'll be heard for other Canadians, right? And so when I always talk about what we can learn, it's that I think part of bringing those voices to the table is for them to be heard. And I will tell you, in law school, one of the hardest things that I learned was it is very easy to have consultations with people and then not take what they said into account. And I think sometimes that's a strategy that we use that I think is deadly about opening access to justice. So my third and final tip, John Pearson, in terms of access to justice, in terms of your careers as paralegals and people working in the legal profession, is you don't have to do everything, but do something. You are a paralegal when you leave this room. You are a paralegal when you pay for a taxi. You are a paralegal in a restaurant. You represent your profession and the knowledge and the power that it holds wherever you go. And so you may not be able to do everything, but I always challenge people to do something. When I first talked about what it was to work with refugees and displaced people in West Africa and in Southern America, people would say to me, I love the work you do, and I'm inspired by it. I have seen Angelina Jolie on the movies, and it looks awesome. It is not that awesome, by the way, but that's for another night. But I can't do that. I have kids, or I have a mortgage, or I don't speak those. I'm not comfortable living in really hot weather. I'm scared of malaria. And what I struggle with is that often people will use this kind of, I can't be Mother Teresa and leave everything I have and give my life, leave my country, move to India, take care of poor kids in the street while they die. So our response is to do nothing, right? Because I can't do pro bono law as my whole career, I'm gonna do none at all. And my challenge to you is to do something, anything. I think one of the other problems that I really struggled with, even in my work at the UN, was it's hard to not want those grandiose events, right? This vision, I had this vision when I first started at the UN, that I'd be on a plane throwing baskets of food to the people. Like, you have these images that we create to show nobility and access to justice and freedom. But I think it's the everyday, do something, little stuff, the difference you make in just hearing somebody. Somebody recently said to me, I know you're not a family lawyer, but if I could just talk to you about my divorce. And my answer was, I can't help you, but I can listen to you, and maybe I can guide you to a resource. And I realized what they just needed was somebody to help them and make them feel like they weren't crazy, right? These everyday little things, not on the front page of the Globe and Mail. For many years, I thought my career would end with me being at the UN and hopefully working in some of the head seats that determine our UN policy in terms of refugees and displaced people. But a few years ago, my mother got sick, When I came back, I realized that my father had aged what felt like decades in a couple of years. And so I made a decision to come home and to figure out a way that I could affect change here. And now I'm working in a university. I'm not working at the highest level of international government. I interact with students, faculty, and staff every day. I talk about sexual harassment, I talk about discrimination, but I also talk about what it means for us to create communities where more people contribute so that we actually have better faculties and better lives. And I love my work, and I think it has meaning, but it doesn't have that big splash meaning that you can, throw on every bio that you're putting out as a keynote speaker. And I realize that. So I guess I'll leave you with a challenge. And my challenge to you is, I want you to think about something that you would do if you had half an hour more. If I gave you half an hour more in your week, and you could do one thing, but you couldn't put it on your resume, you couldn't tell people about it, you couldn't post it on Facebook, no one would ever know, what is the thing you would do? And now I challenge you to do it this week, to take half an hour and do it, and I can tell you that that decision is what's going to roll into organically forming a very big part of your career. Because the things you do that you're passionate about, that we're not doing for credit, and we're not doing for acknowledgement, but we're doing because we actually care about it, those are the things that change our lives. And it was interesting when John Pearson was saying, as an advocate, the most important thing that you have is your reputation. I think that is important, but I'd say as an advocate, the most important thing you have is your sincere passion. Because you might have an extraordinary reputation for doing a good job and having technical skills, but people you are advocating for will follow and believe if you believe, and if you care, and if you are committed, and if you're in it together. So I always end with this quotation by Mother Teresa that I love, and she says, "Do not try to do great things, only do small things, but with great love." Thank you. Do we have time for questions or no? Oh, questions. I usually try to do a 20-minute speech and then let people ask questions so I can do the conversation where you'd like it to go. But if people have questions, I would love to entertain a few. Did I say something funny? No questions? You're too inspired. Okay, wonderful. There doesn't have to be big questions. You can have small questions. Get it? No?
Maybe you could talk about how legal services are delivered, because I think what you're saying about being in the communities might be onto something.
Sure. So the first thing I'd say, the question was around how legal services are delivered. And I'd say the first problem I have is what we're delivering to begin with. Forget how they're delivering, but I think so very often we haven't actually asked people what they need. So if I can use the example of New Orleans, when we got out there, the federal government of the US was trying very, very hard to make sure everybody had food and housing that they could use. And when we went out and actually did the participatory assessment, where we asked people, what is it that you need? People were like, we don't need you to provide food and housing because we can access that ourselves if you give us some financial avenues, so opening up employment opportunities and things like that that'll actually help us to help ourselves. Or what we really need right now is medical aid, because so many people are suffering from some of the outcome of the flood. So one of the things I've learned, especially at the United Nations, is that we often worry about how we provide the services or what the outcome of the provision of the services is, but we don't ask ourselves, are we providing the right services, right? So it was something that I actually followed a lot in the mayoral debate, where the candidates were speaking to communities that they clearly hadn't spoken to before. So if you go into a certain community that has, one example I'll use is a candidate that had a lot of power with a low-income community near Jane and Finch, was talking about this breakfast program that she felt would really, really change the community and give kids access. But her language and her inability to understand what those people were facing, that they weren't proud to say, I need a breakfast program because I'm not feeding my kid. Who's saying that? And what are you making people feel when you're telling them, look how great I am, I'm going to feed your kid breakfast? Versus saying, how can we as an educational institution help you in some of the needs that you need for your kids to be successful? And I think so much of part of our problems with the provision of services is we're not even providing the right thing to begin with. But I think one of the things that I'd have to get to if I looked at provision is the sort of the model we have now of you come to me, you find me, is a huge issue. And figuring out, and a lot of legal clinics are starting to do this now, right? Going to shelters and opening up little booths to say, if we're helping with poverty law, if we're helping people learn about some of the issues that they're going to be facing, let's go to where these people are. One example I always used is when I was at McGill, I did some legal information for Southeast Asian workers. So my mom is Southeast Asian. I felt a strong connection to the community. And I thought the big problem is they don't know that they have these rights, and they don't know they have a right to overtime, and they don't. So I went in there and I was like, you know, I know my mom came from this community. Here's how I'm going to help you, and like I'm going to teach you all the knowledge. And what shocked me was they did know all of their rights. They just couldn't enforce them. So when they went against their boss and said, by the way, I had this right, the boss would just change their shifts and make it so difficult for them, or do stuff where all of a sudden they'd have a lot of complaints, and before they know it, they've lost their job or they're not on probation. And it had never occurred to me because my mother didn't know her rights. My mother was often mistreated, and so then I just assumed these people had the same experience, so I did the exact same thing. And so I went out into the community thinking I was doing the right thing, and they were like, we know our rights. Tell me how I have power to enforce these wonderful rights that you have. And that's one of our biggest problems in giving legal help, right? Is if you don't have the power to enforce it. You know, I participated in a program at McGill that I'm not sure if you have here, but it's called court accompaniment. I don't know if we have something similar. But basically all you do is, you're a student, so you can't provide legal advice. But you just stand by somebody when they're going through the court process. And more I realized, literally we were providing nothing, not even legal information, but what it meant to somebody to not have to stand in front of a judge where they're terrified and have somebody that they thought was a legal person beside them made a difference. And when studies were done, what they started finding out was it made a difference in how those people were treated by the judge, because you now had a witness to be like, hang on a second, you don't get to do that to somebody, that's not right. Or I've read 2 pages of law and I know that something's off. But what is it to have a witness to say, I will stand beside you because you are terrified of this process, right? So I think part of it, what we really need to start looking at in terms of process is how can we appropriately accompany people and finding out from those communities what they need, but also finding out from people who do it. I think one of the things that I've loved to see here is sort of different people in the legal profession working together versus we're all in our silos and this is what lawyers should do and this is what paralegals should do and don't bring this up and don't talk. But what happens when we come together and say, this is our end goal and this is the thing we're thinking about? How can we work together to provide that? And how can we work with communities that can help us understand us that better? It's a very short answer, so be brief. It's very short. John.
This is sort of a follow-up, but to what extent are justice institutions organized for the convenience of the people who work in them rather than the convenience of the people who use the service?
This is webcast, John, so I didn't hear your question. I mean, that is a very, very difficult thing to answer, and I think you would probably have much better answers than I would. I think it's the thing I struggled with the most in law school is seeing a system that I thought was so based on rules and would not be, I think we all pride ourselves on the idea that it's not arbitrary, right? For it to be justice, it shouldn't be arbitrary. And so when I started hearing that 60% of cases on appeal are overturned, I was like, wait a minute, so this person thought this and this person thought the opposite? What does that mean for the rule of law, right? And to go further, what does that mean for the people that have made the laws that tend to serve the people themselves that made it? I mean, it would take a whole night to unpack that, but it's something that I struggle with all of the time. I think I took a group of students to New York to look at some of the stuff that was happening around access to justice. And we went into courts where we talked to judges about people that get evicted and some of the funny things that happen that they don't realize. So one example is they'd have people that were actually representing the landlord and had no legal representation come in and call names. So they'd be like John Pearson. And the person thought they're in a court, so that has to do, you know, that's a legal help. So they'd go out and they'd get them to sign a document saying that they agreed that this time they'd be let off the hook for not paying their rent. But they agreed, and it was final, that if they did it again, they'd be gone. And they had no idea that they were signing that. And the judges were telling us we felt like we were rubber stamping a procedure that these people thought were a legal person coming to help you so that you don't get kicked out of your home. And then you have a final notice that the person's agreed to that if they break it again, they're gone. And sure enough, they were back in a month gone. And so those kinds of things we need to question and we need to think about. And I think people like us that are in privileges of power have to think about and raise them. And one of the things I say to my students all the time is, the best time you can raise something is when it doesn't directly affect you. So if I have my hand up every time it's about women, or Southeast Asian women, or East Africans, my dad's East African, then half the people will hear me and half the people will roll their eyes. But if somebody is talking about Muslims and I put up my hand and I'm a Christian, or if I'm a white man and I put up my hand for having more women at the table, I think it has a different impact. And so I challenge people to think about our positions of privilege. One of the things my mom said to me very early on when I got into Princeton, I was talking about how hard it was to come from having lived in government housing and having struggled the way my parents did and having had been on welfare for some time, and how hard that was to come to a place where so many people had privilege. My mother said, you may not have had privilege growing up, but you have it now. You say Princeton and you have privilege. You get up and talk and you say you went to the UN and you worked at the UN, and people listen to you differently. So when I can acknowledge that privilege, then I can think about how I can create a system for people who don't have it. But again, I would say the best way is that first tip of, if we actually make the people making these laws connect to the communities that they're living in, and we have justices actually have exposure to some of the people's living conditions and houses, I think it would have a huge impact on the way in which we make decisions and we create laws. But that's just me. All right, I know it's late, and I want to thank you for your attention because it was a very long speech. It's been really, really great to be back here. I've heard only good things about today, and I wish you not just the best of success tomorrow, but I hope I see you down the road doing things to build our community because we need you. Thank you.
I just have to say, Toni, that was fantastic. Really appreciate you coming out here to share those words with us. I personally found it very inspiring, and already thinking about how can I help with the knowledge that I have, and how can I help the communities around me. So you've absolutely got me thinking, and I'm sure I'm not the only one in this room, so thank you so much for your time tonight. So now it's that time of the evening where I'm sure all the mooters are just anxious to hear what's going on for tomorrow. In about 1 second here, I'm going to call Fallon Burns up to give you the results of today's event. There are 2 individuals at the back of the room who, on your way out this evening when Fallon's done, is going to be handing out gift bags. There are specific gift bags for the competitors and the judges. So if you can see the women at the back, can you just raise your hands? Thank you. So if you can see them on your way out, they will pass you your gift bags, and I do believe there's also gift bags for the other attendees at the banquet this evening. So without further ado, Fallon?
Hi. That one wasn't so scary. Okay. Before I just give the results, I want to remind everybody that this is a really big group effort that goes into this. I'm just a very small piece of it. See, I have my co-organizers, my teammates, and 3 of my best friends, Doug and Sarah and Karen, and this would not have happened without them, ever. So I also want to thank my faculty members, Karen Schuker and Albert Franti, for writing the materials with us, sitting down with us, spending so many hours over one case. Remarkable, amazing. Thank you. Also want to remind everybody here, the non-legal people, remember to go home and thank your partners, your spouses, for putting up with this sort of competition. When I'm doing a moot, my parents, my brothers and my sister, and those sorts of people hear nothing but moot for an entire month. Thank them for putting up with it, because it takes over your life, it really does. Thank them for putting up with that. How tomorrow's going to work is almost everyone does go on to tomorrow, and the first place team will face the lowest ranked. We will be starting and need you here for about 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Without any further ado, Team 1, I will announce which school it is for the record. I will announce the school name followed by the team number. The first matchup is going to be Centennial, Team 1, against Team 9, Algonquin Careers Academy. Algonquin Careers Academy will select whether they will be the appellant or the respondent. Second matchup is going to be Team 11, Centennial, versus Team 12, Humber, and Humber will select. Team 2, which is Seneca, will face off against Team 4, which is Canadian Business College, and Seneca will select. And then Team 8, Seneca, will face off against Team 5, Centennial. That's all. I'm going to need all of the mooters who are competing tomorrow to come on up and tell us whether you're going to be the appellant or the respondent. That's it. Thank you.